And there's
Okay, sir. Could you first tell me about your award?
Yes. The first thing I knew about it, I got a letter a couple of weeks ago from the Conference of California Historical Societies saying that they were giving me an individual award for uh, history, digging up history in California, and wanted me to come to their conference, which was lasting for 3 days in Concord, California, over east of San Francisco. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that's 450 miles away. Do I go and get that? But the Mojave Historical Society, which together with two people that I didn't have any idea had been sponsors of this thing. One was Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, and the other one was Bill Cooey of the Daily Press, apparently wrote such good letters that the Historical Society was convinced that I was a rare breed of history digger, and so they made the award to me. And I talked to the Historical Society, and they, oh my gosh, yes, oh you got to go and get that award. They actually voted me a sum of money to help pay for the airfare up there. Well, I thought, how in the name of heavens am I going to do this? I'm only 87 and my back aches like $700. But I got my grandson, my older grandson, and he just pitched in and took charge of everything. And so we went up, and on the 26th, today's 25th, pardon me, on the 25th at 12:30 o'clock, they had a big banquet which was attended by some 300 people.
Any dignitaries?
Practically all of them old white-haired duffers like me, most of them women, of course, and they made 6 awards. As far as I know, I got the only individual one. The rest of them were to newspapers, colleges, libraries, and so forth.
Was there anybody, any dignitaries there? Anybody that we'd recognize their names?
Oh, yeah. They asked me to talk, and a lady just ahead of me had talked for 20 minutes. And since I was the last speaker, I had previously asked the man in charge to give me a cutoff date. And so I did start in and talk, and I was telling them, I had a little fun in ribbing them because I said, I have come up here to Superior, California, which is what they are now calling Northern California, from inferior California. And as I said to them, you judge history here by Francis Drake settlement and by the Spanish and Russians coming in and by the Indians. And I said, What would you think if I told you that down where I live in the desert, beside a great inland sea, which was as big as one of the Great Lakes, men and women lived and survived and fought and died 250,000 years ago? Well, they did. And I said, I have helped to dig up some of their artifacts. And I also said to them, we put them in museums. I didn't put them in my, but on my mantle over my fireplace is the skull of a saber-toothed tiger, which lived just about that same time. And the desert where these people lived was the birthplace of the horse and the camel, which migrated across the land bridge to Asia, and in return, across the land bridge from Asia came the bison, which we later called the buffalo, and the great elephants, which, and I said, a friend of mine has dug up one of the skeletons of one of these hairy mastodons right in the town in which I live, and it's got a spear point stuck in a leg of it. And then I went on to say, and do you realize that we live in a desert which was occupied for at least 50,000 years, or at least from 50,000 years ago down to a period of about 12,000 years ago, by a group of refugees from Gondwana. And I said, what were these people like? Well, they were tall, and they were thin, and they were black. They came and paddled their way from Australia across to South America and didn't like it there. So they kept on coming until they could find a place that was like where they had left. And here in our desert is where they found it. And they settled down here. And they brought with them pictographs, that is, paintings in caves, and petroglyphs, which were symbols scratched on the stones. And they brought with them the boomerang, and they brought with them a whole series of taboos and so forth. Now, the funny thing about it was that the Indian didn't come here until, that is, he didn't come across the land bridge until 14,000 years ago. And the Indians divided. Part of them went along the north shore of the Bering Sea, of the Arctic Ocean, and came down through what is called the Athabascan Rift, following the Mackenzie River into the center of the United States. The others came along the shore, and when they were trying to get inland, but the ground was covered with ice, great mantle of ice, maybe as high as 150 feet. And they had to wait until they got out of that ice mass before they could turn inland, and they did. They turned in anywhere from Ventura to Los Angeles and headed in. And how did they get up here? Well, they came up through the Cajon Pass, and they what did they find? They found Apple Valley, one great big lake. And behind it, Lake Mannix, that gorgeous big lake. But they settled around here. And this became their homeland. And we have, and when I say we, I mean the Mojave Historical Society, which began in Victor Valley College way back in 1962. And we have been hunting up the history of the Anasazi. I want to show you people an Anasazi eating dish, which is at least 50,000 years old. And I held it up in my hand. It is small. I said, this was built by an Anasazi woman. I said, you know, then as now, most of the work in marriage and in keeping a society or keeping a race of people going is done by the women. And the gals loved that. And anyway, it was true. It was a little artistic thing. I wish to heavens I had known about it. I'd have brought it over here to show you. It is deep enough to drink from. It's made of stone. It's with the center ground down. And it was washable and reusable. Now, how in the world did I come to get a hold of that? Well, my old man, my father, was probably more interested in archaeology than I am. And he was able to get this from off of San Diego, there at La Jolla. There used to be a big plain that ran out under the ocean. Now remember, the ocean in the Ice Age was 300 feet lower than it is now. And on this big shelf that reached out into the ocean, the Anasazi had a big village out there. And there were hundreds of these eating dishes scattered around there. When the sea rose and came back over, the eating dishes stayed under the water 150 feet down. And Texas A&M University, isn't that interesting that you have to go to universities like Texas A&M or the University of Nebraska or the University of New Mexico, who are interested in California history, and the University of California won't even support the dig up at Calico? It's really amazing that we don't give a damn, we don't care a thing about our own history here, whereas the other states think it's something great. But enough of that. I talked to them, and as I'm talking to you, they finally shut me up by saying it's about time we have to go to another conference room. And so that was that. Now, ask me anything else.
Okay. Getting back to your award, what does it mean to you personally, get an award like this?
I should say to you, I suppose, that an award of this kind builds up my pride and self-esteem. On the other hand, as compared with some of the work that other people have done, I feel very humble about it and feel, well, thanks. I am glad there are recognizing some effort being made down here in Southern California to unearth history. But I was lucky to be just the guy that was picked on to get the award. And I think there are still far more deserving people. You take this fellow, John Swisher, who's president of the Mojave Historical Society. Way back when Vern Lowry was president, and that was probably in 1965 or 66, the society decided to put up historical markers. I went to the extent of getting in touch with the state of California and the city of Victorville and other areas to see what had to be done in order to set up official historical markers. And I did, and I gave it to Vern. And Vern had started it, and I finished it by going down to Los Angeles and finding the owner of the property at near the Edison plant on the south side of Palmdale Road, where the Marmon Road crossed Palmdale Road, and there we were going to build a 35-foot stone tower with a platform and telescopes, or if we didn't put telescopes, we would put pipes, which on one side you could look and see where they crossed the river, and the other, looking through the other pipe, you could see where they went down into the Cajon Pass. Were we ever able to put that across? No. And
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
About was there a gold mine or a silver mine up in the Lucerne area that they're still looking for that's lost? I heard about something like that.
There, Victorville in the early days was famous only for three things: the cattle ranches, the gold mines, and the paving blocks. In probably about 1870, now that's 15 years ahead of the railroads, Fairchild Gilmore Wilton Company came up here and looked around and finally found easy to get at deposits of granite, hard gray granite, that could be chopped up to make a 12 by 3 by 6 inch paving blocks, which laid on edge could pave the streets and the hills of San Francisco and give traction to the horses' hoofs. Remember, there weren't any automobiles in those days. The horses had to get their feet into between these blocks. That is, the toes of their shoes had to grip them. So they came down here with 60 big Swede stone cutters and set up operations in the hills just east of Stoddard Wells Road. Only in those days it was called Stoddard's Well Road because Stoddard only had one well. Anyway, they were there. They camped, and their principal operations were almost directly east of Denny's over there on the freeway. And they camped down at the ford across the river at 6th Street. 7th Street didn't amount to anything in those days. 6th Street was the main street of Victorville. There was very little, if any, D Street, for the simple reason there were a whole string of great big swamps and bogs along D Street. Now, get back to your question. That's the trouble. When you get old, why you start talking this way, and the next thing you know, you're way over here. Anyway, yes, the Sidewinder mine was there, and it is still there. And that mine has one drift in it 7 miles long. It is located just east of and almost opposite the present quarries of Southwestern Portland Cement by Black Mountain. And this Sidewinder mine was going to be used as the refuge center for all the people in this area in the event of nuclear warfare. And as far as I know, it's still stocked with food and beds and that sort of thing. You'll have to ask Walls down there at Victorville Hardware what's happened to it. I suppose it's all locked up. Anyway, that was one mine. There was another mine in Fairview Valley called the Red Top Mine. And it was owned by doctors from Los Angeles who poured millions of dollars into it. Of course, they took millions of dollars out of it, but I don't think they ever made enough to get themselves rich. But
was there a lost mine anywhere?
oh, yeah, sure. You're talking about the mine with the iron door? Well, the mine with the iron door is located somewhere in the gorge just prior to the crossing of the SP Railroad Bridge, the Santa Fe Railroad Bridge, going to our Grant. It was called Gold Gulch. And prior to the 1938 flood, that was a big, deep gulch along there, and there was a gold mine that ran inland from that, and it had an iron door on it. And believe it or not, I've got a key to that door, which was, who do you think gave it to me? Carl Cambridge, bless his heart, the man who knew more about everything around here than anybody I ever met in my life. But I have a key to the old gold mine, and in the Oh, it was either the 85 or the 38 flood, and I'm pretty sure it was the 85 flood, come to think about it, because if it had been 38, there'd been too many people around here who would have known exactly where it was. But that mine was filled up with sand and rubble from the river, because right from what we call the lower Narrows all the way around almost to Barstow was an immense swamp. It was 2 or 3 miles wide, and in it lived deer and bear and especially raccoons and bobcats and coyotes and ducks and geese by the millions and so on. And that big swamp, the Mojave River emptied into it and then oozed out over by Barstow into what was called fish ponds. Fish ponds. There were a whole series of little lakes along the north side of the Mojave River, running east out of Barstow clear over to Daggett, and they were full of seepage water from the Mojave River, and they were also naturally stocked with fish, and around them was plenty of grass, and the old government road came along over there, and everybody stopped at fish ponds. Actually, Penny Morrow, he died just a year or so ago at age 100. Penny was born at fish ponds. Anyway, and from him, of course, I've learned a raft of history of this area around here.
Okay, I got another one for you. We're having a big drought right now, and I'm wondering if you have any history, you recall any history about maybe some rainmakers that rainmakers maybe have been in this area through the years, either here or in Big Bear or...
I don't think we had to have rainmakers. Most rainmakers that I've heard about, of course, have been either in the San Diego area or were back east. And goodness knows there were a number of famous ones who had all kinds of fancy ways to try and produce it.
There was
But
a gentleman named Hatfield.
remember, when I was a boy, in 1921, I fought a forest fire in the San Bernardino Mountains that denuded a tremendous amount. Now, I remember when the snow used to hang under the trees until June in the San Bernardino Mountains. Our mountains here have been swept with one successive fire after another. Do you know that right southeast from where we are here is called the Ord Mountains, and that great bunch of hills south of Apple Valley were heavily covered, just like Hesperia, with great forest of juniper trees. And those, bless her heart, I've talked to a little old Gertie Bowen, who's now dead. And Gertie used to tell about the herds of half-wild cattle and the great herds of wild horses that roamed that area. And we have not had a water problem here because of the fact that the winter snows did not melt until about this time of year off of the San Bernardino Mountains. And the Mojave River always flowed full. The Hesperia and Apple Valley, I wish I could show you some of the advertising that was put out in Los Angeles way back in 1910, showing great wells gushing with water. All they had to do was dig holes in the ground and the water would pop out of it.
Have we ever had a drought here?
What's that?
Have we ever had a drought?
Not really significant. Not really significant. We can and will. On the other hand, we can and will have floods. Do you realize that in 1852, that was the year the Mormons came down and built their stockade in San Bernardino, that it rained for 30 consecutive days in the mountains. And the Santa Ana River rose to such a terrible rate that it was a mile wide at south of the hill on which the stockade was built in San Bernardino, that the water gushing out of Lytle Creek and coming around through Verdamont cut straight across and joined the water coming down from Warm Creek, and San Bernardino was an island sitting on a hill. I grew up with the Mormon boys down there, and I have heard stories from them and from the sons of the original Mormons, with whom I used to do a lot of hunting around. And they told me a story of a Mexican boy who lived over at Jurupa, which is, by Riverside, on the other side of the Mojave River. And he stood in San Bernardino and looked at this great flood going along there. He says, "I'm going to swim over." They tried their best to dissuade him. Oh, he said, "I'm a good swimmer." He jumped in and he got maybe 150 feet off, and that was the last they saw of him. Because this water, like the Colorado River, was carrying a great volume of sand along with it, and it just weighted him down and he was gone. But even as I go to the county offices now, I tell the clerks, and they look at me with amused amazement, and I used to say to them, "I used to trap muskrats down here for 50 cents a skin, right where your building is." And so I did. And I have hunted along the Mojave River opposite where Spring Valley Lake is now, and scared out herds of a dozen deer, and even chased a half-grown bear. I had a shotgun. I wasn't prepared to shoot bears or anything, but I had fun chasing the bear for about a quarter of a mile down the river. My father said to me when I got home, and I said to him with some pride, "I chased a bear." And he said to me, "Did you ever stop to think what would happen if you met its mother?" Well, anyway.
Can I ask another question? Do you have any history from the Antelope Valley area?
Well,
or Little Rock, for instance, they have I've noticed they have ruins out there along the side of the road in Little Rock, and I was told that in the early part of this century there was a group of communists that migrated out there, that had a community out there.
sure, that was Yano. They weren't called communists in those days. They were called socialists. And they did go out there. And they did put in a tremendous amount of work. And as you go out Palmdale Road, and just after you cross the county line, you can see remnants of these stone buildings standing around there. And up toward the mountains is a Catholic order. I don't know, there are dozens of them, have taken over and made a monastery out of their main ranch operation up there. And the thing finally broke up, like all socialist programs do, by the fact that some did the work and the rest of them sat around and did the eating and the talking. And finally, those that got tired of doing the work said, "To heck with you," and off they went, and the nail collapsed on its face. Now, gosh, I'm taking an awful lot of time here. I'm glad to tell you. You asked about, the people who live around here are so naive about history. They don't know that right in Victorville is one of the old sawmill buildings that stood originally at Big Bear Lake before it was even a lake, and that it was brought down here and set up as a barn, and there it is. It's 100 and
Okay, where is that, you were saying about them bringing down from Big Bear Lake, before it was Big Bear Lake,
yeah,
a barn or
yeah.
something? Where did they put it?
It's on the Turner Road there, right next to the Williams Ranch, and just this side of the George Air Force Base on the south side. Swisher and I thought we had located a duplicate of the Wells Fargo station right behind where Aaron Lane used to have his place. Now, Lane was there in 1857. And the Mojave Historical Society blew his story out of the water. We found that Aaron had served in the Mexican War, and he came here at the conclusion of the Mexican War, which was over in 1848, and settled at the ford of the river. Now this ford was just ahead of the great big swamp. They couldn't have, the freighters couldn't have got across the swamp at any other through the swamp, so they had to cross ahead of it. But the big problem, and you mentioned about water and drought, those hills, even the city of Victorville drew its water out of the hills, not out of wells going down. The water was flowing out of the hills, and I know all about what happened to them and so forth. Over inlanders, east of the road between Lucerne and Yucca Valley, by about 6 miles, in a little isolated valley in there, is a simply huge rock. And it is an enormous monolith, all standing all by itself in the floor of this little valley. And that was called Giant Rock. And now, getting back to what I said, when World War II broke out, the head of the draft board in Pasadena came to me and said, "Can you hire this man so that he can go on with his work?" And I said, "What's he doing?" And he said, "He is training troops in hand-to-hand combat. He is a civilian, and he is doing this for the Army, and he's doing it without pay, and we feel that this is a kind of work that should be taught, and that we cannot take and spare him to be drafted, and whether the Army will ever recognize it or not, we don't know." And I said, "Well, what can he do?" And he said, "Well, he's a pretty good photographer." And since I was doing photographic work for Caltech and many big industries, I said to him, "Well, bring him over and I'll work him into my photographic group." And they said, "Well, we want you to understand that most of the time he won't be there because he'll be out training troops." And I said, "Well, since I'm not in the service now, I'll do that." And so I hired Bob Seeger. And Seeger was training Patton's troops. And one day Seeger came back to me and said, "Hey, you want to see something of very great interest?" And I said, "Yeah, what?" And he said, "We closed in on a German spy, and when we found him, why, he blew himself up. And he had built a place under a great big rock." And I said, "Well, that would be interesting." So I loaded Seeger and my wife and kid into my old 1940 Ford, and we took off. And we went over there. In order to get to it, we had we had to follow a bunch of little dirt roads and trails, but we finally came out to Giant Rock. and we found that the place was occupied by military vehicles at the time. There were a dozen of them stationed around there. Now, this German, who had been a captain in the German Navy in World War I, had migrated out to California, and sometime prior to World War II, he had graded out 2 airfields, one right beside the giant rock, which would be for fighter planes, and one in a cross canyon farther up, which was big enough for small bombers. And he had done that with a simple tractor and a drag. And he had dragged these fields and cleared them all off. He had dug under this rock and built himself 1, 2, 3 rooms. One was a big room. The soldiers were even using it for a mess hall. The small room as you came in has what they called a wireless room in those days, radio, and was full of destroyed equipment when I got there, and even spattered on the walls were part of the German. What he had built a maze of tunnels and small rooms in a big rocky ridge to the east of his place. Now, I was telling Bill Cooey about this, and Bill really ran the story down, and it appeared in the daily press. From this radio setup, the man was sending out messages in what were called burp signals. In other words, you send out your Morse code, and then you condense it, and it comes out sounding like static. But
Where did he get his water? I heard something about
he had climbed up on this rock and had pasted on little cement eave troughs, you could call them, and they all led down and spilled into a cistern. And when I first was there, the cistern was pretty nearly full of water. But the soldiers had been throwing beer cans and all kinds of junk into it, so that it was a mess. But it was easy to see.
Is that from dew?
That would have been dew and or rainfall that supplied him with water. The man was a working fool. He brought his equipment and supplies in over little dirt roads from Barstow rather than from anywhere around his place, so that no one would find it.
And is this place still there?
Yeah. Cooey found out that the old man had been investigated at the start of the war, but they considered that he was too old to do any harm or anything, and so nobody had followed up on it. But after the discovery of these burp signals, they got in touch with the sheriff's office, not in San Bernardino, in Riverside County. And four of them went out, and they closed in on him, and he welcomed them into his place, but then he went into his radio room, and one of the men was standing fairly close to him. The others were a little bit to one side. And when he got inside of his room, he touched a button on something that he had, and he was completely wrapped in dynamite. And it blew him to shreds. It blew the deputy sheriff that was in front of him flat and injured him. The other two sheriffs were knocked over, but were not particularly hurt. And that is the story. Now, the theory is that he was in contact with German or Japanese submarines off of the coast.
And that place is still intact? I mean, people can go there today and see?
It was taken over by a bunch of people who were dealing with extraterrestrials, and so they said that they were having spaceships land on the little airfield out there, and that thing ran on for about 10 or 15 years. And finally, the government stepped in and took over the thing and bulldozed shut the entrances under the rock. Now, you can go around the rock still, but you can't get underneath it. And Bill Cooey said that he discovered from talking to these deputy sheriffs that they had found a secret room, but what was in it, I don't know. But it was I was in the big room. I was in what was left of the radio room. But opening off of the big room, going up some steps, I'm behind a hanging, a big, not a curtain, it was called a hanging. It had some kind of a scene on it. Yeah, if you pulled that thing aside, you could find this stairway which led up to this large room, and apparently it was the living quarters for this old man. And I wish, this is the thing that just kills me. I keep forgetting names. I knew that old German's name just